I thought I was going to Lake Norman for a peaceful weekend at our vacation home, but instead I found utility bills with my husband's name, paired with a woman called Emma Rodriguez. What I discovered next shattered everything I believed about my 12-year marriage. Children's toys scattered across the living room. Family photos on the mantle showing David with 2 kids I'd never seen before. And a life he'd been living in secret for 6 years. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He just looked me in the eyes and said I wasn't enough for him, that he needed a real family. That's when I realized the woman I'd become in this marriage wasn't who I was meant to be. What happened next changed everything, and by the time David begged me to stay, it was already too late. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah, and I've always been the type of person who sees the good in everyone, sometimes to my own detriment. At 35, I'd built what I thought was a solid life in Charlotte, North Carolina, working as a part-time graphic designer, while my husband David managed his marketing firm downtown. We'd been married for 12 years, and while things weren't perfect, I believed we had something real, something worth fighting for. I was the kind of wife who remembered anniversaries, who packed his lunch every morning, who believed that love meant sacrifice and compromise. Looking back now, I realize I was sacrificing everything while he was compromising nothing. Our lake house in Lake Norman had always been my sanctuary. David bought it 3 years into our marriage, calling it our investment in the future, our place to escape and reconnect. Every few months, I'd suggest we spend a weekend there together, but David always had excuses. Too much work, upcoming deadlines, client meetings that couldn't wait. He'd promise we'd go next month, next season, next year. I stopped pushing after a while, accepting his explanations the way I'd learned to accept so many things in our marriage. He told me he went there occasionally to check on the property, to do maintenance, to make sure everything was secure. I trusted him completely. That Friday morning started like any other. David kissed my forehead before leaving for work, mentioning he'd be late because of a client dinner. I had finished a particularly challenging design project for a local restaurant and decided to treat myself to a surprise weekend at the lake house. I wanted to sit by the water, read the book that had been gathering dust on my nightstand, and maybe finally use the art supplies I'd been meaning to bring up there for months. It felt spontaneous and freeing, the kind of thing the old Sarah would have done before she became so focused on being the perfect wife. The drive to Lake Norman usually calmed me, but that day I felt an strange energy, like something was shifting in my world. The autumn leaves were gorgeous, painting the landscape in brilliant oranges and reds, and I found myself thinking about how long it had been since David and I had enjoyed something beautiful together. When was the last time we'd taken a walk just to talk? When had we stopped sharing our dreams with each other? These thoughts felt dangerous somehow, like I was approaching territory I'd been avoiding for too long. I pulled into the driveway of our lake house around 2 in the afternoon, immediately noticing that the lawn had been recently mowed and the flower beds looked maintained. David had mentioned doing yard work a few weeks ago, so I felt grateful that he was taking care of our investment. The house looked peaceful and well-loved, exactly the way a vacation home should look. I grabbed my overnight bag and the groceries I'd picked up for the weekend, excited to have some time to myself in this beautiful space. But the moment I stepped inside, everything felt wrong. There were children's sneakers by the front door, small ones that belonged to kids maybe 6 and 8 years old. A child's jacket hung on the coat rack next to David's familiar windbreaker. In the living room, toys were scattered across the coffee table, and I could see a tablet plugged into the charger with a kid's game still paused on the screen. My first thought was that David must have invited his brother's family up for the weekend and forgot to mention it. But that didn't make sense because his brother lived in California and rarely visited. I walked through the house in a daze, cataloging details that didn't belong in my world. There were photos on the mantle that made my heart stop entirely. David, looking relaxed and happy, with his arms around 2 children I'd never seen before. A little boy with David's dark hair and a girl with pigtails, both beaming at the camera. In another photo, David was teaching the boy to fish off our dock, the same dock where he'd promised to teach our future children to fish someday. The photos looked recent, taken in different seasons, showing a progression of time and familiarity that spoke to years of relationships, not casual visits. In the kitchen, I found a refrigerator covered with children's artwork, drawings signed by Tyler and Chloe, with messages like, "I love you, Daddy," and "Best Dad Ever," written in crayon. The reality was starting to crash over me in waves, but I still couldn't quite process what I was seeing. David didn't have children. We didn't have children. We'd been trying for years, going through fertility treatments, dealing with the heartbreak of miscarriages, and he'd been so supportive through it all. Or at least I thought he had been. I found myself moving through the house like a detective, looking for more clues to explain this impossible situation. In the master bedroom, there were women's clothes in the closet, not expensive or fashionable, just regular mom clothes in a size smaller than mine. There were 2 toothbrushes in the bathroom holder, and the medicine cabinet contained children's vitamins and a woman's prescription bottles. The name on the prescription made my hands shake. Emma Rodriguez. The address was our lake house address. That's when I found the utility bills. They were stacked neatly in the desk drawer in David's home office. And I almost didn't look at them, because managing household bills had always been his responsibility. But something compelled me to check. Maybe the same instinct that had brought me to the lake house that day when I'd never made an impromptu trip before. The electric bill, the water bill, the internet service, all of them were addressed to David Martinez Rodriguez and Emma Rodriguez at our address. Not David Williams, which was his real last name and mine. Martinez Rodriguez, like they were married, like they were a family. I sat in that office chair for what felt like hours, staring at those bills and trying to make sense of what they meant. The dates went back 6 years. 6 years of utility bills for a family that wasn't supposed to exist, at a house that was supposed to be ours. 6 years of David living a completely different life while I waited at home, planning our future, believing in us. The betrayal was so enormous that my mind couldn't quite grasp it all at once. It felt like trying to swallow the ocean. My phone buzzed with a text from David asking how my day was going, the same casual check-in he sent every afternoon. For a moment, I considered calling him immediately, screaming at him, demanding explanations. But something held me back. Maybe it was shock, or maybe it was the instinct for self-preservation that kicks in when your entire world is collapsing. Instead, I texted back that I was fine, working on a new project, and asked about his client dinner. He responded with details about the restaurant and his plans to be home late, the same easy lies he'd probably been telling me for years. I spent the rest of that afternoon going through every inch of the house, finding more evidence of the life David had built without me. Bank statements showing joint accounts I'd never heard of. A school directory with Emma Rodriguez listed as Tyler's mother and David Martinez Rodriguez as his father. Birthday party invitations addressed to their family. A Father's Day card from the children thanking him for being the best daddy in the world. Each discovery felt like another knife twist. But I kept looking because I needed to understand the scope of what he'd done. The most devastating find was a photo album hidden in the bedroom closet, filled with pictures that told the story of a happy family. David at the hospital holding a newborn baby. David teaching Tyler to ride a bike. Family vacations to places I'd never been. Christmas mornings with presents under a tree I'd never seen. Birthday parties and school events and ordinary moments that should have been ours. In every photo, David looked genuinely happy, more relaxed and content than I'd seen him in years. It was like looking at the life of a stranger who happened to have my husband's face. I found myself crying in that bedroom, not just from the betrayal, but from the realization of what this meant about our entire marriage. While I'd been struggling with fertility issues, believing we were in it together, he'd been creating the family he wanted with someone else. While I'd been making excuses for his absences and his emotional distance, he'd been present and engaged with another woman and her children. While I'd been sacrificing my career goals and social life to be a better wife, he'd been building a completely separate existence that didn't include me at all. The sun was setting by the time I finally accepted what I was seeing. David had been living a double life for 6 years. He had a girlfriend named Emma Rodriguez who apparently believed he was available enough to share a household and raise children with. He had 2 kids who called him daddy and drew him pictures and loved him the way I'd always dreamed our children would love him. He had created the exact life we'd talked about wanting together, just not with me. I drove home that night in a fog of disbelief and rage, my mind racing with questions and scenarios. How had he managed this logistically? How had Emma never questioned why he couldn't spend certain holidays with them? How had he explained his absences to her? Did she know about me at all? Or was she as much a victim of his lies as I was? The children were clearly attached to him, which meant he wasn't just visiting occasionally. He was actively parenting them, being present in their lives in ways he'd never been present in mine. When David came home that night, kissing my forehead and asking about my day with the same casual affection he'd shown me that morning, I felt like I was looking at a complete stranger. This man who'd been sharing my bed, eating meals I cooked, making plans for our future, had been living an entirely different life that I knew nothing about. The level of deception was staggering. It wasn't just an affair or a moment of weakness. It was a sustained, deliberate construction of an alternate reality that had been going on for half the length of our marriage. I didn't confront him that night. I couldn't find the words, and part of me still hoped there was some explanation that would make sense of what I'd found. Maybe Emma was his sister, and he'd been helping her after a divorce. Maybe the children were his nephews, and the family photos were just documentation of his role as their favorite uncle. I spent the night lying awake next to him, creating increasingly desperate scenarios that might explain away what I'd discovered. Because accepting the truth meant accepting that everything I'd believed about my life was a lie. But deep down, I knew there was no innocent explanation for what I'd found. The utility bills alone proved that David had been maintaining a household with another woman for years. The prescription bottles with Emma's name. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Name, the school directory listing him as Tyler's father, the intimate family photos. They all pointed to the same devastating conclusion. My husband had another family, and he'd been keeping us completely separate, lying to both of us about the most fundamental aspects of his life. The next morning, David left for work with the same routine as always, kissing my forehead and promising to call me later. I watched him drive away and realized that I had no idea where he was actually going, or what he was actually doing with his days. How much of what he'd told me about his work, his schedule, his business trips had been fabricated to cover up his time with Emma and the children? How long had I been living with a man who was essentially a stranger? I called in sick to my part-time design job and spent the day trying to process what I'd learned. I found myself going through our photo albums, looking for signs I'd missed, clues that might have told me David was living a double life. There weren't many photos of us together in recent years, I realized. David was always the one taking pictures, rarely appearing in them himself. When we did have photos taken together, at weddings or family events, he looked stiff and uncomfortable, nothing like the relaxed, joyful man I'd seen in the pictures with Emma and the children. I thought about all the times he'd come home late, all the business trips that seemed to happen with unusual frequency, all the weekends he'd spent supposedly working or maintaining the lake house. I thought about how he'd become less interested in physical intimacy over the years, always having excuses about being tired or stressed. I thought about how he'd gradually stopped talking to me about his dreams and goals, becoming more distant and distracted, even when we were in the same room. The signs had been there, I realized. I'd just been too trusting, too focused on being understanding and supportive, to recognize them for what they were. I'd explained away his behavior, because I'd wanted to believe in us, because I'd invested so much of myself in making our marriage work. I'd been so busy trying to be the perfect wife that I'd never stopped to question whether he was being a faithful husband. That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out who Emma Rodriguez was, and I was going to learn the truth about David's other life. I wasn't going to confront him until I had all the facts, until I understood exactly what I was dealing with. For 12 years, I'd trusted David completely, believing everything he told me without question. Now I was going to discover who my husband really was, even if the truth destroyed everything I'd built my life around. I had no idea that what I was about to uncover would be even worse than what I'd already found. Or that by the time I was finished investigating, I'd discover strength I never knew I had, and make choices that would transform me into someone I'd never imagined I could become. The next morning brought a strange clarity that I hadn't expected. While David showered and prepared for another day of his carefully constructed lies, I sat at our kitchen table drinking coffee and staring at the utility bills I'd brought home from the lake house. In the harsh morning light, they seemed even more damning. Emma Rodriguez had been paying household bills at our vacation home for 6 years. 6 years of shared responsibility for a property I'd believed belonged to David and me alone. I found myself studying Emma's name, wondering what kind of woman she was. Did she love David the way I had loved him? Did she trust him completely, the way I had trusted him? Was she sitting in another kitchen somewhere, drinking her morning coffee, and planning a future with a man who was lying to her just as thoroughly as he'd been lying to me? The thought that she might be as much a victim as I was should have made me feel sympathy for her, but instead it made me feel something I'd never experienced before. A cold, calculating anger that surprised me with its intensity. I waited until David left for work before I started my investigation. I'd never been a suspicious person, never felt the need to check up on anyone or verify their stories. Trust had always come naturally to me, maybe too naturally. But that morning, I felt like a detective gathering evidence for a case that would determine the rest of my life. I started with the basics, using my laptop to search for Emma Rodriguez in the Charlotte area. What I found made my hands shake as I scrolled through the results. Emma Rodriguez, age 31, worked as a nurse at Charlotte Presbyterian Medical Center. She had social media profiles that weren't set to private, and as I clicked through her photos, I saw the story of David's secret life laid out in chronological order. There were pictures of her with Tyler, who appeared to be about 8 years old, and Chloe, who looked to be around 6. In the older photos, it was just Emma and Tyler. But David started appearing in pictures around the time Chloe would have been born. The photos showed birthday parties and family outings, trips to the zoo and the beach. Ordinary moments that painted a picture of a stable, loving family. David appeared comfortable and natural with the children. Not like someone playing a role, but like someone who genuinely belonged in their lives. In recent photos, Chloe had David's distinctive dimple when she smiled, and Tyler had inherited his serious expression when concentrating. Looking at these children, I realized with a shock that they might actually be David's biological children, not just stepchildren he'd taken on. I found myself studying Emma's face in these photos, trying to understand what David saw in her that he didn't see in me. She was pretty in a understated way, with long dark hair and a warm smile. She looked like someone who laughed easily, someone who found joy in simple moments. In every photo, she seemed genuinely happy, radiating the kind of contentment I'd been chasing in my own life for years. She looked like a woman who believed she was loved, who had no reason to question the man in her life. As I scrolled through more photos, I found images that made my stomach turn. David and Emma at what appeared to be a wedding, him in a suit I'd never seen before, her in a blue dress that brought out her eyes. David holding newborn Chloe in a hospital room, looking exhausted but proud in the way new fathers do. Family Christmas mornings with David in pajamas I didn't recognize, surrounded by wrapping paper and children's laughter. A life I'd never been part of. Milestones I'd never witnessed. Intimacy I'd never shared. The most devastating discovery came when I found Tyler's school website and saw David listed as an emergency contact. Not just listed, but designated as Tyler's father with full authorization to pick him up from school, attend parent-teacher conferences, and make medical decisions. This wasn't casual involvement. This was full parental responsibility, legal recognition, the kind of commitment that required paperwork and planning and absolute intention. I realized I was crying when the tears started dropping onto my laptop keyboard. Not the angry, frustrated tears I'd expected, but deep, grieving sobs for the death of everything I'd believed about my life. I wasn't just losing a husband. I was losing the future I'd planned, the children I'd hoped we'd have together, the dreams we'd shared about growing old as a couple. I was losing 12 years of memories that now felt contaminated by the knowledge of what David had been doing behind my back. But underneath the grief was something else, something that surprised me with its strength. Relief. For years, I'd felt like something was wrong with our marriage but couldn't identify what it was. David had been distant, distracted, less interested in building a life with me. I'd blamed myself, wondering if I wasn't attractive enough, successful enough, interesting enough to hold his attention. Now I knew the truth. It wasn't that I wasn't enough. It was that he'd already found what he was looking for somewhere else. I spent the rest of the morning gathering information like pieces of a puzzle. I found Emma's work schedule online, cross-referencing it with David's claimed business trips and late nights. The correlation was perfect. When David told me he had to work weekends, Emma's social media showed family outings to places I'd never been. When David claimed he had client dinners, Emma posted photos of home-cooked meals with the children. When David said he was traveling for business, Emma's check-in showed they were all together at the lake house that was supposed to be ours. The level of coordination required to maintain this deception was staggering. David had essentially been living two completely separate lives, with different schedules, different responsibilities, different identities. To me, he was David Williams, the ambitious marketing executive who worked long hours and traveled frequently for business. To Emma and the children, he was David Martinez Rodriguez, the devoted father and partner who came home for dinner every night and never missed a school play or soccer game. I found myself wondering about the practical aspects of his double life. Did he keep separate phones, separate email accounts, separate bank accounts? How did he manage to be present for important moments in both households? What did he tell Emma when he couldn't be there for bedtime stories or weekend plans? What elaborate lies had he constructed to explain why he couldn't move in with her completely? Why he couldn't marry her? Why their relationship had to be conducted in secret? The children's social media profiles, managed by Emma, provided more pieces of the puzzle. Tyler played soccer, and David appeared in team photos as one of the assistant coaches. Chloe took dance classes, and David was there for her recitals, looking proud and engaged in ways I'd never seen him. They had inside jokes and special traditions, evidence of years of shared experiences that had created genuine bonds between them. I realized that what hurt the most wasn't just the betrayal. It was seeing David be the man I'd always wanted him to be, just not with me. In these photos, he was present, engaged, actively participating in family life instead of just going through the motions. He was the father I'd dreamed he'd be to our children, the partner I'd hoped he'd become as our marriage matured. But he'd given that version of himself to someone else, while leaving me with the distant, distracted man who came home late and made excuses for why he couldn't fully commit to building a life together. By afternoon, I had constructed a timeline of David's deception that went back to the beginning of his relationship with Emma. It appeared they'd met when Tyler was around 2 years old, which meant Emma had been a single mother when David entered their lives. He'd gradually taken on more of a parental role with Tyler while also apparently fathering Chloe. The children had grown up with David as their primary father figure, which meant that any disruption to this arrangement would devastate them just as much as it was devastating me. This realization added another layer to my grief. These children, who had done nothing wrong, would be hurt by whatever happened next. They loved David the way I'd once loved him, with complete trust and faith in his presence in their lives. When the truth came out, their world would be shattered too. Emma would discover that the man she'd built her life around was married to someone else. Tyler and Chloe would learn that their father had been living a lie that affected their entire family structure. As the day wore on, I found myself moving through the stages of grief at breakneck speed. Denial had lasted only long enough for me to confirm what I'd found at the lake house. Anger came in waves, sometimes directed at David for his betrayal, sometimes at myself for being so trusting, sometimes at the unfairness of a situation where there were no winners, only victims. Bargaining manifested as desperate attempts to find explanations that might make this okay. Scenarios where David had good reasons for what he'd done. But it was the depression that hit me hardest. As the full scope of David's deception became clear, I felt myself sinking into a darkness I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the revelation that my entire adult life had been built on a foundation of lies. Every anniversary we'd celebrated, every future plan we'd made, every intimate moment we'd shared had been contaminated by his secret life with another family. I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about myself. How could I have been so completely oblivious to what was happening? Were there signs I'd missed because I didn't want to see them? Had I been so desperate to maintain the illusion of a happy marriage that I'd ignored red flags that would have been obvious to anyone else? Was I really as perceptive and intelligent as I'd always believed? Or was I just naive and easily manipulated? The worst part was realizing how isolated I'd become. Over the years, I'd gradually lost touch with many of my friends, partly because David never seemed enthusiastic about social events, and partly because I'd been so focused on trying to improve our relationship. I'd turned down invitations and skipped girls' nights, always prioritizing David's schedule and preferences. Now I was facing the biggest crisis of my life, with no support system, no close friends I could call for advice or comfort. When David came home that evening, I watched him perform his usual routine with new eyes. He kissed my forehead the same way he had for years, asked about my day with what seemed like genuine interest, and shared details about his work that I now suspected were complete fabrications. He was so convincing, so natural in his deception, that I found myself almost doubting what I'd discovered. This was the man I'd loved for 12 years, the man I'd trusted with my heart and my future. How could he look me in the eye and lie so effortlessly? During dinner, I found myself studying his face, looking for tells or signs that might indicate when he was being dishonest. But there were none. He was simply himself, or at least the version of himself he'd chosen to show me. When he mentioned staying late at the office the next day for a project deadline, I wondered if he was actually planning to attend Chloe's dance recital or help Tyler with homework. When he talked about a weekend business trip that was coming up, I suspected he was planning to take his other family on a vacation I'd never be invited to join. The hardest part was maintaining my own facade. I smiled and nodded and responded to his conversation as if nothing had changed, but inside I felt like I was fracturing. Every word he spoke felt like another small betrayal, another reminder that the man sitting across from me was essentially a stranger who'd been playing a role in my life for years. I wanted to scream at him, to demand explanations, to force him to acknowledge what he'd done to me, to us, to the life I'd thought we were building together. But I didn't. Something held me back, some instinct that told me I needed to be strategic about this. David had been planning and executing this deception for years. He had resources and relationships I didn't know about, accounts and assets that might not be in my name, legal complications that could affect any divorce proceedings. If I was going to confront him, I needed to be prepared. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I played my hand. That night, lying in bed next to him while he slept peacefully, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be the trusting, passive wife anymore. I was going to investigate David's double life thoroughly, gather evidence of his deception, and figure out exactly how deep this betrayal went. I was going to understand the financial implications, the legal ramifications, and the emotional toll of what he'd done before I decided how to respond. I was going to take control of this situation, instead of just reacting to it. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time in my entire marriage, I was going to put my own needs and interests first. I was going to protect myself and my future, even if it meant discovering truths that would hurt even more than what I already knew. As I lay there in the darkness, listening to David breathe beside me, I realized that the woman who had discovered those utility bills yesterday was already gone. In her place was someone harder, more suspicious, more determined to uncover the truth no matter what it cost. I didn't know yet what I would do with the information I gathered, but I knew I couldn't live with the uncertainty and partial knowledge I had now. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of dismantling the lies that had shaped my life for 6 years. I would learn exactly who David really was, what he'd taken from me, and what he owed me in return. I would discover the full scope of his betrayal, and then I would decide how to move forward with the knowledge that my marriage had been a sham and my husband was a stranger. Part 3. The inner shift sleep became impossible after that first night of knowing the truth. I would lie in bed, listening to David's steady breathing, wondering how he could rest so peacefully while living such an elaborate lie. Every small sound he made, every movement, every unconscious sigh, reminded me that I was sharing a bed with someone I didn't really know. The man I'd trusted with my heart, my future, my most vulnerable dreams had been systematically deceiving me for years while I slept beside him, completely unaware. The morning brought a strange kind of clarity that I hadn't expected. As I watched David go through his morning routine, shaving with the same methodical strokes he'd used for years, I realized that something fundamental had shifted inside me overnight. The desperate pleading part of me that had spent years trying to understand why our marriage felt disconnected had been replaced by something cooler and more analytical. I wasn't the heartbroken wife anymore. I was a woman gathering intelligence on an adversary. I found myself observing David's behavior with the detachment of a scientist studying a specimen. When he checked his phone and smiled slightly at something he read, I wondered if it was a text from Emma or one of the children. When he kissed my forehead before leaving for work, I analyzed the gesture for authenticity and found it wanting. There was no real affection in it, just the performance of affection, the maintenance of a routine that kept me from asking uncomfortable questions. After he left, I stood in our bedroom looking at the space we'd shared for so many years, and it felt like a crime scene. This room where I'd cried over our fertility struggles while he already had children with someone else. This bed where I'd reached for him countless times only to be gently rejected because he was tired or stressed, while he was probably saving his energy and attention for his other family. This dresser where he kept clothes I'd helped him pick out, not knowing he had an entirely different wardrobe for his other life. I realized that the woman I'd been yesterday, the trusting wife who made excuses for her husband's distance and absences, had been complicit in her own deception. I'd enabled David's lies by being so understanding, so willing to accommodate his explanations without questioning them. I'd been so afraid of seeming needy or demanding that I'd essentially given him permission to treat me as secondary to everything else in his life. That version of myself felt foreign to me now, like a character I'd been playing without realizing it. The real Sarah, the woman I'd been before I became so focused on being the perfect wife, wouldn't have accepted David's behavior for as long as I had. She would have demanded answers, insisted on transparency, required her partner to prioritize their relationship instead of treating it like an afterthought. I needed to find that woman again, to remember who I was before I became so consumed with making David happy that I forgot to protect my own interests. I spent the morning going through our financial records with new eyes, looking for evidence of David's deception that I might have missed before. I'd never been particularly involved in managing our money, trusting David to handle investments, taxes, and major financial decisions. Now I realized that this trust had been another mistake, another way I'd made it easy for him to hide his double life from me. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. There were accounts I'd never known about. Credit cards in David's name only? Investment portfolios that didn't include me as a beneficiary. Money that should have been going toward our shared goals had been diverted to support his other family. The modest lifestyle I'd accepted, believing we were saving for our future together, had been a lie designed to hide the fact that David was supporting two households simultaneously. The mortgage payments on the lake house were being split between our joint account and an account I'd never seen before, one that apparently belonged to David and Emma jointly. She'd been paying rent to live in a property I'd believed we owned outright. David had been collecting money from her to pay for utilities and maintenance on a house that was supposedly our vacation home, our investment in the future. He'd been profiting from her payments while lying to both of us about the true nature of the arrangement. I found receipts for children's clothes, school supplies, and extracurricular activities that I'd never questioned when I saw them mixed in with our other expenses. I'd assumed they were gifts for his employees' children, or donations to charity drives. Now I realized he'd been supporting Tyler and Chloe's needs, while I struggled to understand why we couldn't afford to start our own family, why he was always reluctant to discuss having children seriously. The financial deception ran deeper than just hidden accounts and secret expenses. David had been claiming Tyler and Chloe as dependents on his taxes, receiving thousands of dollars in benefits that he'd never mentioned to me. He'd been receiving child support payments from Tyler's biological father that were being deposited into accounts I didn't know existed. He'd essentially been running a parallel financial life that was completely separate from our marriage. As I pieced together the scope of his financial betrayal, I felt my grief transforming into something more powerful and focused. This wasn't just emotional infidelity or a secret relationship. This was systematic fraud, a deliberate campaign to steal from our marriage to support his other life. David had been robbing me of the financial security I thought we were building together, using money that should have been ours to create a comfortable life for his secret family. I realized I needed professional help to understand the full implications of what I'd discovered. I called a family law attorney, claiming I needed advice for a friend who'd discovered her husband's financial infidelity. The consultation was eye-opening and terrifying. According to the lawyer, David's actions could be considered dissipation of marital assets, which meant I might be entitled to compensation for the money he'd diverted to support his other family. But it also meant that proving his deception would require extensive documentation and potentially expensive legal proceedings. The attorney explained that cases involving secret families were particularly complex because they often involved multiple jurisdictions, hidden assets, and emotional complications that could make divorce proceedings extremely difficult. David had been careful to structure his deception in ways that might make it hard to prove in court. Emma might be considered a victim rather than a co-conspirator, which could complicate any attempts to recover money he'd spent on her and the children. I hung up from that conversation feeling overwhelmed by the legal and financial complexities of my situation, but also more determined than ever to gather evidence of David's betrayal. If I was going to confront him, if I was going to leave him, if I was going to start over at 35 with my entire life plan destroyed, I needed to protect myself as much as possible. I couldn't afford to be naive or trusting anymore. I had to be strategic and thorough. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before in our entire marriage. I hired a private investigator. I'd found Rebecca Chen's name through a discreet online search, and her specialization in marital infidelity cases made her perfect for my situation. When I met with her at a coffee shop far from my neighborhood, I felt like I was entering a world I'd never imagined I'd need to navigate. Rebecca was professional and compassionate, explaining that what I'd discovered was unfortunately more common than I might think. She'd handled several cases involving men who maintained complete second families while staying married to their original wives. The deception required careful planning and significant resources, but it was entirely possible for someone with David's income and lifestyle to pull it off successfully for years. She explained that my case was actually stronger than many she'd seen, because I'd already gathered substantial evidence of David's double life. The utility bills, the social media photos, the school records, and the financial documentation I'd found provided a solid foundation for proving his deception. What she needed to do was fill in the gaps, document his daily routines, and gather proof of the relationship's timeline and scope. Rebecca assured me that I could trust her to be discreet while she investigated David's activities. She would track his movements, photograph his interactions with Emma and the children, and document evidence of their cohabitation at the lake house. She would also investigate the financial aspects of his deception, tracing money flows and identifying assets that might be hidden from me. As we discussed the details of her investigation, I felt myself transforming even further from the woman I'd been just days before. I was authorizing surveillance of my own husband, planning to gather evidence that would destroy our marriage and potentially devastate the children who'd grown up thinking of him as their father. It felt ruthless and calculating, but it also felt necessary. David had made choices that brought us to this point. I was simply responding to the situation he'd created. That evening, when David came home and asked about my day with his usual casual interest, I lied to him for the first time in our marriage. I told him I'd spent the day working on design projects and running errands, the kind of mundane activities that wouldn't prompt follow-up questions. I watched him nod and smile, apparently satisfied with my deception, and realized how easy it was to lie to someone who wasn't paying close attention to your life. We sat through dinner together, making small talk about work and weekend plans, and I marveled at how normal it felt despite everything that had changed. David was relaxed and conversational, sharing stories about his colleagues and asking about my upcoming projects. If I hadn't known about Emma and the children, if I hadn't seen the evidence of his double life, I might have thought this was one of our better evenings together in months. But knowing what I knew now, I could see the performance in his behavior, the way he checked his phone discreetly, probably responding to messages from his other family. The way he mentioned working late tomorrow, which I now suspected meant attending one of Chloe's activities or spending time with Tyler. The way he talked about a business trip next week that was probably a family vacation I'd never be invited to join. I found myself studying his face as he talked, looking for signs of guilt or discomfort that might indicate he suspected I knew about his deception. But there were none. David was completely confident in his ability to maintain his lies, secure in the belief that I would never question him or investigate his activities. He'd been deceiving me successfully for so long that it had become effortless for him. That realization sparked something new in me, something I'd never felt before in our relationship. I wasn't just hurt or angry anymore. I was insulted by his assumption that I was too naive or too dependent on him to uncover the truth. He'd underestimated me completely, treating me like someone who could be managed and manipulated indefinitely. He was about to learn that the woman he'd taken for granted had more strength and intelligence than he'd ever bothered to notice. As we got ready for bed that night, I watched David go through his nighttime routine and realized that this might be one of the last times I'd see him like this, unguarded and unaware that his world was about to collapse. Within days, Rebecca would have documented proof of his double life. Within weeks, I'd have legal representation and a plan for moving forward. Within months, this house, this bed, this illusion of marriage would all be part of my past. The thought should have terrified me. I was about to voluntarily destroy the only life I'd known as an adult, to give up the security and familiarity of marriage for the uncertainty of starting over alone. But instead of fear, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about my future. For the first time since I'd found those utility bills, I was looking forward instead of backward. I was going to reclaim my life from a man who'd been stealing it from me piece by piece for years. I was going to discover who I really was when I wasn't trying to be the perfect wife to someone who didn't deserve my effort. I was going to build something new and authentic, instead of continuing to maintain something that had been fake from the beginning. David had no idea that the quiet, trusting woman lying beside him had already begun planning his downfall. He thought he was safe in his elaborate deception, secure in his ability to maintain two separate lives indefinitely. He was about to discover that the biggest mistake he'd made wasn't starting a secret family. It was underestimating the woman he'd betrayed. Part 4. The quiet preparation. The transformation from devastated wife to strategic opponent happened faster than I could have imagined. Within a week of hiring Rebecca, I'd developed routines and skills I'd never needed before. I learned to lie convincingly about my daily activities, to hide my emotional state behind a mask of normalcy, and to gather evidence without arousing David's suspicion. It was like discovering I had a talent for espionage that had been dormant my entire life. Rebecca's first report confirmed what I'd already suspected, but provided details that made David's deception even more damning. She'd followed him for 3 days and documented a pattern that revealed just how extensively he'd been lying to me. On Tuesday, when he told me he was working late on a client presentation, he'd actually picked up Tyler from soccer practice and taken both children out for pizza. On Wednesday, his claimed business dinner was actually a parent-teacher conference at Chloe's school. On Thursday, his emergency client meeting was a family trip to the grocery store, where he, Emma, and the children shopped together like any normal family. The photos Rebecca provided were devastating in their ordinariness. David pushing a grocery cart while Chloe rode on the front and Tyler walked beside him, all of them laughing at something. David and Emma standing close together at the school, her hand on his arm as they talked with Chloe's teacher. David helping Tyler with homework at the kitchen table in the lake house, while Emma cooked dinner in the background. These weren't stolen moments or secret meetings. They were the daily activities of a committed family man, just not with his legal family. What struck me most about the surveillance photos was how comfortable and natural David looked in his role as father and partner to Emma. There was none of the tension or distraction I'd become accustomed to seeing in him at home. He was fully present, engaged, and obviously happy in ways I hadn't seen him in years. It wasn't just that he was cheating on me. It was that he was being his authentic self with them, while giving me a pale imitation of who he really was. Rebecca had also managed to document the financial aspects of David's double life with impressive thoroughness. She'd traced his movements to banks where he maintained accounts I'd never known about, photographed him making deposits that weren't reflected in our joint financial statements, and identified credit cards he used exclusively for expenses related to his secret family. The scope of his financial deception was staggering, involving tens of thousands of dollars over the years that should have been part of our shared assets. More damaging still, Rebecca had discovered that David had been falsely representing his marital status in official documents related to the children. School records listed him as Tyler's stepfather and Chloe's biological father, with no mention of being married to anyone other than Emma. Medical insurance forms showed the children covered under a family plan that identified Emma as his spouse. Tax documents claimed head of household status for his relationship with Emma and the children while simultaneously filing jointly with me. The evidence Rebecca gathered painted a picture of systematic fraud that went far beyond simple adultery. David hadn't just been having an affair or maintaining a secret relationship. He'd been living as a completely different person, with different legal obligations, different financial responsibilities, and different family commitments. He'd essentially created a parallel identity that allowed him to be the man he wanted to be, while keeping me trapped in a marriage to someone who didn't really exist. Armed with this information, I began preparing for the confrontation I knew was inevitable. I couldn't continue living with David while knowing what I knew, pretending everything was normal while he continued his elaborate deception. But I also couldn't confront him until I'd protected myself legally and financially. I needed to be ready for whatever came next, whether that was divorce proceedings, custody issues related to the children he'd claimed as his own, or financial disputes over the assets he'd hidden from me. I opened my own bank account for the first time since we'd been married, slowly transferring money from our joint savings in amounts small enough to avoid David's notice. I gathered copies of all our important documents, including tax returns, insurance policies, and investment statements that David had always handled exclusively. I researched divorce attorneys who specialized in complex cases involving hidden assets and marital fraud. Most importantly, I began rebuilding the support system I'd neglected during my marriage. I reached out to old friends I'd lost touch with, carefully rekindling relationships without revealing what was happening in my marriage. I joined a book club and a hiking group, creating new social connections that weren't tied to David or our shared history. I needed people in my life who knew me as an individual, not just as half of a couple that was about to implode. The hardest part of my preparation was maintaining the facade of normalcy with David. Every evening, I had to sit across the dinner table from him and pretend I didn't know about his double life. I had to listen to his lies about work obligations and business trips without challenging him. I had to accept his casual affection and routine conversations while knowing that he was giving his real emotional energy to another family. There were moments when the strain almost broke me. When David mentioned staying late at the office, and I knew from Rebecca's surveillance that he was actually helping with Tyler's science project. When he claimed to be too tired for intimacy, and I'd seen photos of him looking relaxed and energetic with Emma and the children just hours before. When he talked about our future plans together, discussing retirement dreams and travel goals that I now knew were complete fantasies designed to keep me placated. But I forced myself to stay focused on the larger goal. Every day I didn't confront David was another day to gather evidence, to strengthen my legal position, and to prepare for the aftermath of exposing his deception. I couldn't afford to act on emotion or impulse. I had to be as calculating and strategic as he'd been in maintaining his lies. 3 weeks into my investigation, Rebecca presented me with a breakthrough discovery that changed everything. She'd managed to obtain copies of legal documents that David had filed in connection with Tyler's enrollment in a private school program. The paperwork identified David as Tyler's adoptive father and Emma as his wife, with their relationship dating back 7 years. Not only had David been living as Emma's husband, but he'd actually legally adopted Tyler and was listed as Chloe's biological father on her birth certificate. This revelation meant that David's deception was even more extensive than I'd realized. He hadn't just been playing house with Emma and the children. He'd made legal commitments that contradicted his marriage to me. He'd adopted a child and fathered another while married to someone else, creating a situation that would have serious legal ramifications when it was exposed. Rebecca explained that David's actions could be considered bigamy in some interpretations, since he'd essentially been functioning as a married man to 2 different women simultaneously. Even if he hadn't gone through a formal marriage ceremony with Emma, his legal responsibilities to her children and his representation of their relationship as a marriage could create complicated legal issues that would affect any divorce proceedings. The birth certificate listing David as Chloe's father was particularly significant because it established paternity rights and responsibilities that would continue even after his deception was exposed. Emma and the children weren't just victims of his lies. They were legally connected to him in ways that meant his betrayal of me would have lasting consequences for their family structure as well. I realized that when I finally confronted David, I wouldn't just be ending our marriage. I'd be exposing a web of legal complications that would affect multiple families and potentially devastate children who'd done nothing wrong. Tyler and Chloe had grown up with David as their father figure, legally and emotionally. Learning that he'd been married to someone else their entire lives would shatter their understanding of their family and their place in his life. This knowledge added another layer to my internal transformation. I wasn't just a betrayed wife seeking justice for myself anymore. I was someone who held information that would change multiple lives irrevocably. The power was intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. I could destroy David's carefully constructed world with a single conversation, but doing so would hurt innocent people who'd trusted him just as completely as I had. As I wrestled with the ethical implications of what I'd discovered, I found myself changing in ways that surprised me. The passive, accommodating woman who'd spent years making excuses for David's behavior had been replaced by someone who could make hard decisions and live with their consequences. I was discovering strength I'd never known I possessed, along with a capacity for strategic thinking that had been dormant throughout my marriage. I began planning not just for the confrontation with David, but for the aftermath. I researched apartments in different neighborhoods, looking for places where I could start over without constant reminders of the life I'd thought I was building with him. I updated my resume and began networking in design circles, preparing to rebuild the career I'd diminished to focus on being a wife. I investigated therapy options, knowing I'd need professional help to process the trauma of discovering that my entire adult life had been built on lies. Most importantly, I started envisioning a future that didn't include David or the identity I'd constructed around being his wife. For the first time in 12 years, I was planning a life that was entirely my own, based on my own goals and desires, rather than trying to fit into someone else's vision of what our relationship should be. The woman who'd found those utility bills a month ago had been completely unprepared for the revelation of her husband's betrayal, but the woman I was becoming was ready for whatever came next. I'd learned to be suspicious instead of trusting, strategic instead of reactive, protective of my own interests instead of endlessly accommodating. I discovered that I was capable of deception when necessary, investigation when required, and planning when my future depended on it. David had no idea that his lies had created the very thing he'd been trying to avoid: a strong, independent woman who no longer needed him, or the illusion of security he'd provided. His betrayal had freed me from the constraints of trying to be the perfect wife to someone who didn't deserve my efforts. In trying to keep me in the dark about his true priorities, he'd inadvertently shown me how capable I was of taking care of myself. The moment I truly understood who I had become happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon when David called to tell me he'd be working late again. Instead of the familiar pang of loneliness and disappointment I'd felt for years, I experienced something entirely different: relief. Relief that I wouldn't have to pretend to be happy to see him. Relief that I wouldn't have to make dinner conversation while watching him lie to my face. Relief that I could spend the evening planning my future without his presence contaminating my thoughts. Standing in our kitchen after hanging up the phone, I caught my reflection in the window and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. She had my face, my hair, my body, but something essential had changed. Her eyes held knowledge that mine hadn't possessed a month ago. Her posture suggested confidence that I'd never felt as David's wife. Her expression carried determination that the old Sarah had never been able to access when it came to protecting her own interests. I realized I was looking at the woman I'd been before I met David, before I'd gradually diminished myself to fit into his vision of what a wife should be. But she was also someone new, someone forged by betrayal and hardened by necessity. She was someone who could lie convincingly when required, investigate thoroughly when needed, and plan strategically when her survival depended on it. She was someone I was proud to become. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I cooked a meal just for myself, something David didn't like, and ate it slowly while reading a book I'd been wanting to finish for months. I took a long bath without worrying about using all the hot water. I called my sister in California and had a real conversation about my thoughts and feelings, not just the sanitized version of my life I'd been sharing for years to avoid questions about my marriage. For the first time since discovering David's betrayal, I felt truly alone in our house, and instead of the crushing loneliness I'd expected, I felt free. The space felt different when I wasn't sharing it with someone who was mentally and emotionally somewhere else. The silence felt peaceful instead of oppressive. The solitude felt chosen rather than imposed. I found myself walking through the rooms of our house and seeing them with new eyes. This living room where I'd spent countless evenings trying to engage David in meaningful conversation while he scrolled through his phone, probably responding to messages from his other family. This kitchen where I'd cooked elaborate meals hoping to create intimate moments that never materialized because his attention was always divided. This bedroom where I'd lain awake wondering why my husband seemed so distant, never imagining that his heart and mind were literally in another house with other people. Every room held memories of my attempts to create the marriage I'd wanted, and now I could see how futile those efforts had been. David hadn't been present for any of it. Not really. He'd been going through the motions of being a husband while saving his authentic self for the family that truly mattered to him. I'd been trying to build intimacy with someone who was performing the role of partner, while his real emotional investment was elsewhere. The realization should have been devastating, but instead it was liberating. All those years I'd blamed myself for our lack of connection, wondering what was wrong with me that I couldn't capture my husband's full attention. All those nights I'd gone to bed feeling inadequate, questioning whether I was interesting enough, attractive enough, successful enough to deserve his complete commitment. All those moments I'd swallowed my needs and desires to avoid seeming demanding or needy. Now I understood that the problem had never been me. I couldn't compete for David's attention because I was competing against a secret family he'd chosen over me years ago. I couldn't create the intimacy I craved because he was already experiencing it somewhere else. I couldn't build the partnership I wanted because he'd already found his ideal partner and was just going through the motions with me. This knowledge transformed my understanding of our entire relationship history. David's gradual emotional withdrawal hadn't been about stress or work pressure. It had been about his increasing investment in another life. His lack of interest in starting a family with me hadn't been about timing or financial concerns. It had been because he'd already started the family he wanted with someone else. His reluctance to make long-term plans with me hadn't been about uncertainty or caution. It had been because his real future was with Emma and the children. I spent that evening going through photo albums and keepsakes from our marriage, but instead of feeling nostalgic or heartbroken, I felt like an archaeologist studying artifacts from a civilization I'd never really understood. Our wedding photos showed a woman who looked radiantly happy, and a man who seemed more focused on the performance than the commitment. Vacation pictures revealed the same pattern. Me looking genuinely joyful to be spending time together, him appearing restless and distracted even in moments that should have been romantic. The evidence of his emotional absence had been there all along, but I'd been so invested in maintaining the illusion of a happy marriage that I'd refused to see it. I'd made excuses for his behavior, blamed external circumstances for our problems, and convinced myself that things would improve once he was less busy, less stressed, more settled in his career. I'd been living in denial about the fundamental reality that David simply didn't want the same kind of marriage I wanted. But the woman I was becoming understood that David's betrayal, while cruel and devastating, had actually freed me from a relationship that was never going to give me what I needed. I'd been fighting for the attention and commitment of someone who'd already decided I wasn't worth his best efforts. I'd been trying to create something meaningful with someone who was saving his capacity for meaning for other people. This revelation sparked something I hadn't felt in years: excitement about my own potential. For so long, I defined myself in relation to David and our marriage. I was his wife, his partner, his supporter, but rarely just myself. I'd sublimated my own goals and interests to focus on our relationship, believing that being a good wife meant making his priorities my priorities. I'd gradually become a supporting character in my own life. Now I was remembering who I'd been before I became so consumed with being the perfect partner. I'd been ambitious, creative, independent, someone who made decisions based on her own values rather than trying to please someone else. I'd had dreams and goals that had nothing to do with marriage or relationships. I'd been confident in my own worth, not constantly seeking validation from someone who was incapable of giving it. I realized that David's betrayal, while devastating, had also given me an unexpected gift. It had forced me to confront the reality that I'd been living a half-life, pouring all my energy into trying to fix something that was broken from the beginning. It had shown me that I was capable of surviving without the security and identity I'd thought I needed from marriage. It had revealed strength and resilience I'd forgotten I possessed. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anticipation for the day ahead. Not because anything particularly exciting was planned, but because I was no longer dreading the routine interactions with David that had become such a burden. I was no longer measuring my worth by his mood or attention level. I was no longer responsible for maintaining the illusion that we had a functioning marriage. I found myself moving through my morning routine with a lightness I'd forgotten was possible. Making coffee just the way I liked it without considering David's preferences. Choosing clothes that made me feel confident, rather than trying to please someone who barely noticed what I wore. Planning my day around my own goals and interests instead of organizing everything around David's schedule and needs. When David emerged from the shower, I observed him with the same detached interest I'd developed for studying a complex puzzle. He went through his usual routine, checking his phone multiple times, probably coordinating with Emma, or responding to messages from the children. He mentioned his plans for the day, a mixture of actual work obligations and fabricated meetings that I now knew were covers for his time with his other family. But instead of feeling hurt or excluded by his lies, I felt something closer to pity. David was living such a complicated existence, constantly juggling multiple identities and responsibilities, always having to remember which version of himself he was supposed to be at any given moment. He was trapped in a web of deception that required constant maintenance and vigilance. He couldn't be authentic with anyone because he was lying to everyone in different ways. I was beginning to understand that David's betrayal said far more about his character than it did about my worth as a wife or partner. He'd chosen deception over honesty, complexity over authenticity, compartmentalization over integration. He'd built his life on a foundation of lies that would eventually collapse under their own weight. When that happened, he'd lose everything he'd tried so hard to keep. Meanwhile, I was discovering that I could build something new and authentic from the rubble of our marriage. I didn't have to continue pretending to be someone I wasn't or accepting less than I deserved. I could create a life based on honesty, transparency, and genuine connection with people who valued those qualities. I could prioritize my own happiness instead of sacrificing it for someone who didn't appreciate the gift I'd been offering. That afternoon, I did something that would have been unthinkable a month ago. I called in sick to my part-time design work and spent the day doing things that brought me joy. I visited an art museum I'd been wanting to see for years, but had never suggested because David found museums boring. I had lunch at a restaurant I'd discovered online, but had never tried because David was picky about food. I bought a book of poetry that spoke to something deep in my soul, but that David would have dismissed as pretentious. Each small act of independence felt like a declaration of self-worth. I was reclaiming my right to make choices based on my own preferences, rather than constantly deferring to someone else's opinions. I was rediscovering interests and passions I'd suppressed because they didn't align with David's vision of who we should be as a couple. I was becoming myself again, but stronger and more self-aware than I'd ever been before. Walking through the museum that afternoon, studying paintings that moved me to tears with their beauty and power, I realized that I'd been living in emotional poverty for years without recognizing it. I'd accepted such a limited version of love and partnership that I'd forgotten what it felt like to have my interests valued, my opinions respected, my emotional needs prioritized. I'd been so grateful for the crumbs of attention David offered that I'd never demanded the feast of genuine intimacy I deserved. The woman I was becoming understood that she deserved more than crumbs. She deserved someone who was excited to hear her thoughts, curious about her dreams, interested in her growth as a person. She deserved a partner who chose her every day, not someone who kept her around for convenience while investing his real emotional energy elsewhere. She deserved honesty, transparency, and the kind of love that didn't require her to diminish herself to receive it. As I drove home that evening, I felt a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with seeing David and everything to do with continuing the process of becoming who I was meant to be. I was no longer afraid of the future or devastated by the loss of the marriage I'd thought I wanted. I was excited about the possibility of building something better, something authentic, something that honored who I really was, instead of requiring me to pretend to be someone else. David's betrayal had been intended to keep me in the dark while he pursued what really mattered to him. Instead, it had illuminated truths about myself and my worth that I might never have discovered otherwise. He'd tried to use me as a placeholder while he built his real life elsewhere. Instead, he'd inadvertently shown me that I was capable of building something real and meaningful on my own. The confrontation was still coming. The legal and financial complexities of untangling our lives would be challenging. The process of rebuilding my life as a single woman at 35 would require courage and determination I was still developing. But for the first time since finding those utility bills, I was looking forward to what came next instead of grieving what I was losing. I was ready to stop being David's wife and start being myself again. I was ready to demand the kind of love and partnership I deserved instead of accepting whatever scraps someone was willing to offer. I was ready to build a life based on authenticity and self-respect instead of compromise and accommodation. The woman David had betrayed was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to settle for less than she deserved. He had no idea what he'd created through his deception, but he was about to find out. Part 4. The bold move. The morning I decided to take action arrived with an unusual clarity that felt like stepping out of fog into brilliant sunlight. David had left for what he claimed was a 3-day business conference in Atlanta, but Rebecca's surveillance had already confirmed he was actually taking Emma and the children to Disney World. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I'd been begging him for years to plan a vacation together, he was creating magical memories with his secret family at the most romantic destination on Earth. I stood in our empty house that Friday morning, looking at the suitcase David had packed with clothes I'd helped him choose, and realized I was done being a spectator in my own life. I was done gathering evidence, done preparing for possibilities, done waiting for the perfect moment to act. David was living his authentic life while I was still trapped in the performance of being his wife. It was time to stop preparing and start doing. The first call I made was to my attorney, Margaret Chen, a sharp woman in her 50s, who specialized in complex divorce cases involving hidden assets. I'd been consulting with her for weeks, but this time I wasn't asking hypothetical questions or seeking advice for future planning. I was ready to file for divorce immediately, to stop David's financial hemorrhaging of our marital assets, and to expose his deception before he could do any more damage. Margaret had been waiting for this call. She'd reviewed all the evidence Rebecca had gathered and confirmed that I had grounds for a divorce based on adultery, fraud, and dissipation of marital assets. More importantly, she'd identified legal strategies that could protect me from the financial consequences of David's betrayal, while ensuring he faced appropriate consequences for his systematic deception. The second call was to Rebecca, asking her to document David's Disney World trip with comprehensive photography and video evidence. I needed irrefutable proof that while he was claiming to be at a business conference, he was actually on a family vacation with the people who truly mattered to him. This wasn't just about my divorce proceedings anymore. It was about creating a record of his deception that would be impossible for him to explain away or minimize. The third call was the hardest one I'd ever made. I called Emma Rodriguez at the hospital where she worked, identifying myself as David's wife, and asking if we could meet to discuss something urgent. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought she'd hung up, but finally she whispered that she'd meet me at a coffee shop near the hospital during her lunch break. Driving to meet Emma felt like approaching the edge of a cliff, knowing I was about to jump but no longer afraid of the fall. This conversation would detonate the carefully constructed world David had built, destroying the illusion of security for multiple families, while exposing truths that would change everyone's lives irrevocably. But continuing to live in his web of lies wasn't an option anymore. The truth had to come out, no matter how painful it would be for everyone involved. Emma was already seated in a corner booth when I arrived, clutching a coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly. She was prettier than her social media photos suggested, with warm brown eyes and shoulder-length dark hair that she kept tucking behind her ears nervously. She looked exactly like what she was, a hard-working single mother who'd believed she'd found a reliable partner to help her raise her children. Looking at her across that table, I realized we were both victims of David's deception, just in different ways. She'd built her life around a man she believed was available and committed to her family, never suspecting he had a wife who was equally convinced of his devotion. The children she was raising with David as their father figure had no idea their family structure was built on lies that could collapse at any moment. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult I'd ever had, but also one of the most necessary. I showed Emma copies of our marriage certificate, photos from our wedding, and documentation of our shared financial accounts and property ownership. I watched her face cycle through disbelief, confusion, anger, and finally a devastating comprehension that mirrored what I'd experienced when I first found those utility bills. Emma's responses confirmed what I'd suspected about David's manipulation tactics. He'd told her he was divorced, that his ex-wife had been emotionally unstable and financially irresponsible, that the settlement had been complicated and required ongoing legal oversight. He'd explained his absences by claiming his ex-wife was still creating problems that required his attention, but that he was committed to Emma and the children despite these complications. She'd never questioned his story because it explained his occasional unavailability and the financial constraints that sometimes limited their activities. She'd been sympathetic to his supposed struggles with a difficult ex-wife, grateful that he was willing to prioritize her and the children despite these challenges. She'd trusted him completely, just as I had trusted him, because he was convincing and consistent in his lies. The most heartbreaking part of our conversation was learning about David's relationship with Tyler and Chloe from Emma's perspective. He wasn't just present in their lives, he was actively engaged in their development, attending every school event, coaching Tyler's soccer team, teaching Chloe to ride a bike. He'd been the father figure Tyler had never had, and the only father Chloe had ever known. His involvement in their lives wasn't casual or convenient. It was committed and comprehensive. Emma broke down crying when she realized what this meant for her children. Tyler had been calling David Dad for 6 years, believing he'd finally found the stable family structure he'd always craved. Chloe had never known life without David as her father, couldn't imagine a world where he wasn't part of her daily routine. Learning that their family was built on lies would devastate them just as much as it was devastating Emma and me. But Emma was also angry, and her anger was directed entirely at David rather than at me. She understood immediately that I was as much a victim of his deception as she was, that neither of us had consented to sharing a man who was living a double life. She was furious that he'd put her children in a position where they could be hurt by the consequences of his lies, that he'd made her complicit in a deception she'd never agreed to participate in. We spent 3 hours in that coffee shop, comparing stories and filling in gaps in each other's understanding of David's behavior. Emma's timeline of their relationship confirmed that David had been systematically lying to both of us for years, maintaining elaborate stories that explained his divided attention and limited availability. He'd been incredibly careful to keep us completely separate, ensuring that neither of us had any reason to suspect the other existed. By the end of our conversation, Emma and I had developed an unlikely alliance based on our shared betrayal and our mutual desire to protect ourselves and the children from further damage. She agreed to cooperate with my attorney's investigation and to document David's deception for any legal proceedings that might follow. More importantly, she committed to helping me ensure that Tyler and Chloe were protected and supported through whatever chaos was about to unfold. That evening, alone in the house David would be returning to in 2 days, I began implementing the plan Margaret and I had developed. I photographed every document, every financial statement, every piece of evidence that demonstrated David's deception and financial fraud. I transferred additional funds from our joint accounts to my separate account, ensuring I'd have resources to support myself through the divorce process. I packed David's belongings methodically, not out of anger but out of necessity. He wouldn't be living in our house when he returned from Disney World. He'd be moving back to the lake house with Emma and the children, where he belonged and where he'd been happiest for years. I wasn't throwing him out in a fit of rage. I was simply acknowledging the reality that he'd already chosen where his home really was. The hardest part of that evening was writing the letter I'd leave for David to find when he returned. I wanted to be clear about what I knew, why I was ending our marriage, and what would happen next, but I also wanted to maintain the dignity and strength I'd developed over the past weeks. I wasn't going to beg him to choose me over Emma and the children. I wasn't going to give him the opportunity to lie his way out of what he'd done. The letter was direct and unemotional, stating facts rather than expressing hurt. I told him I knew about Emma, Tyler, and Chloe. I told him I'd filed for divorce and that my attorney would be in contact about dividing our assets and addressing his financial deception. I told him his belongings were packed and that he should collect them at his convenience, but that he was no longer welcome in our house. I ended the letter by thanking him for showing me who he really was, and for inadvertently teaching me what I deserved in a relationship. I told him I hoped he'd be happy with the family he'd chosen, and that I was looking forward to building a life based on honesty and authentic connection rather than lies and performance. Saturday morning, I moved out of the house I'd shared with David for 8 years, taking only what was mine and leaving behind everything that represented our life together. I'd rented a furnished apartment across town, a place where I could start fresh without constant reminders of the marriage that had never been what I thought it was. The apartment was small but bright, with windows that faced east so I could watch the sunrise each morning. It felt like a sanctuary, a space that was entirely mine where I could begin the process of rebuilding my life without David's presence or influence. For the first time in 12 years, I was living somewhere that reflected my taste, my preferences, my vision of what a home should feel like. That weekend, I experienced something I hadn't felt since I was in college: complete autonomy over my time and space. I could read without interruption, listen to music David didn't like, eat whatever sounded good to me, and make plans that didn't require consultation or compromise. The solitude that should have felt lonely instead felt liberating. I spent Sunday afternoons setting up my new home office, creating a space where I could rebuild my design career without the constraints I'd accepted during my marriage. I had been working part-time for years, telling myself it was temporary until David and I started a family. Now I realized I'd been using the dream of children as an excuse to avoid pursuing my professional goals with the intensity they deserved. On Monday morning, while David was presumably still at Disney World with his real family, I walked into my new life with confidence I'd never possessed as his wife. I had my first consultation with a potential client, a restaurant owner who wanted to completely rebrand her business. As I listened to her vision and began sketching ideas, I felt creativity and ambition flowing through me in ways they hadn't for years. That afternoon, Margaret called to tell me that David had tried to contact her office, claiming there had been a misunderstanding and demanding to know what was happening with the divorce filing. She'd informed him that all communication needed to go through her office, and that his first priority should be finding his own legal representation. The panic in his voice had been evident, she said, but so had his continued attempts to control the narrative and minimize his responsibility for what was happening. Rebecca called that evening with updates from Disney World, confirming that David had spent the weekend playing the devoted father and partner while having no idea that his other life was being systematically dismantled. The photos she'd taken showed him appearing relaxed and happy, clearly believing his deception was still intact and his two separate worlds would continue operating independently. He had no idea that Emma and I had met, that we'd compared stories and discovered the full scope of his lies. He didn't know that his financial deception had been documented and reported to my attorney. He couldn't imagine that the passive, trusting wife he'd left behind had transformed into someone capable of strategic action and self-protection. When David returned from his fake business trip, he'd find an empty house, a letter explaining that his double life had been exposed, and legal papers that would force him to account for years of systematic deception and financial fraud. He'd discover that the woman he'd taken for granted had found the strength to choose herself over a marriage that had been destroying her slowly for years. The bold move I'd made wasn't just leaving David or filing for divorce. It was reclaiming my agency, my autonomy, and my right to build a life based on truth rather than accepting one built on lies. I'd stopped being a victim of his deception and become the architect of my own future. For the first time in years, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I needed to do, becoming exactly who I was meant to become. The woman David had betrayed was gone, replaced by someone who understood her worth and refused to settle for anything less than she deserved. Part 5. The Resolution and New Beginning. David returned from Disney World on a Tuesday afternoon, and I wasn't there to witness his discovery of the empty house and the letter that would destroy his carefully constructed world. Rebecca was, though, positioned discreetly across the street with telephoto lenses and recording equipment to document his reaction for potential legal proceedings. She later told me that she'd never seen someone's entire reality collapse so visibly in such a short span of time. According to Rebecca's report, David stood in our empty living room for nearly 20 minutes, reading and rereading my letter as if repetition might change its contents. He called my name several times, apparently hoping I was somewhere in the house, despite the obvious evidence that I'd moved out completely. He tried calling my phone repeatedly, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails that ranged from denial to anger to desperate pleading. Margaret had instructed me not to respond to any of David's attempts at direct communication, and I was surprised by how easy it was to ignore his calls and messages. The woman I'd been a month ago would have felt compelled to answer, to explain myself, to soften the blow of what I was doing to him. But the woman I'd become understood that David had forfeited his right to my consideration when he'd chosen to build his life on lies that devastated everyone who trusted him. His voicemails, which Margaret advised me to save for potential legal proceedings, revealed more about David's true character than 12 years of marriage had. Instead of acknowledging his deception or expressing remorse for the pain he'd caused, he focused on damage control and self-preservation. He claimed I was overreacting, that I didn't understand the complexity of his situation, that there were explanations for everything if I just give him a chance to clarify. The most telling message came the third day after his return, when he apparently realized that Emma and I had been in contact. His tone shifted from pleading to angry, accusing me of manipulating her against him and destroying his relationship with children who needed him. The irony of him accusing me of manipulation was staggering, but it also confirmed what I'd suspected about his psychology. David genuinely believed he was the victim in this situation, that his deception had been justified and our discovery of it was somehow unfair to him. Emma called me that same evening, her voice shaky but determined. David had shown up at the lake house demanding answers, apparently believing he could convince her that I was lying or exaggerating what I'd discovered. Instead, she'd confronted him with the evidence I'd shared and demanded the truth about our marriage. His response had been to claim that our marriage had been over for years, that he'd been planning to divorce me but hadn't wanted to hurt me during a difficult time in my life. The creativity of his lies was almost impressive. According to the story he told Emma, I'd been struggling with mental health issues that made me unstable and vindictive. He claimed he'd been protecting her and the children from my supposedly erratic behavior, that he'd been trying to handle our divorce quietly to avoid exposing them to unnecessary drama. He painted himself as a man trapped between two impossible situations, trying to do right by everyone while being unfairly attacked by a woman who couldn't accept that their marriage was over. Emma wasn't buying any of it. She'd seen the documentation I'd provided, including recent photos of David and me together at social events where we appeared to be a happy couple. She'd heard him talk about future plans with me, including vacation destinations and retirement dreams that contradicted his claim that our marriage had been dead for years. Most importantly, she'd realized that if David could lie so convincingly to both of us for so long, there was no reason to believe anything he said now. The confrontation at the lake house had ended with Emma telling David to leave and not return without her permission. She needed time to process what she'd learned and to figure out how to explain to Tyler and Chloe that their family structure was based on lies that were now being exposed. She'd made it clear that any future relationship with David would depend on his willingness to be completely honest about his deception and to accept full responsibility for the damage he'd caused. David's response, according to Emma, had been to become increasingly agitated and controlling. He demanded to know what I'd told her, insisted that she was making a mistake by trusting me over him, and threatened to take legal action if she prevented him from seeing the children. His mask of charming manipulation had slipped completely, revealing the entitled, narcissistic man underneath who couldn't accept that his victims were refusing to continue enabling his deception. That weekend, I received a visit from Tyler, who'd apparently convinced Emma to let him come see me. He was a serious 8-year-old with David's dark eyes and an emotional maturity that broke my heart. He wanted to understand why his family was falling apart and whether the man he'd called dad for most of his life had been lying to everyone he claimed to love. Talking to Tyler was one of the hardest conversations I'd ever had, but also one of the most important. I explained that sometimes adults made bad choices that hurt the people they were supposed to protect, and that what was happening wasn't his fault or Chloe's fault. I told him that David did love him and his sister, but that love didn't excuse lying or justify hurting other people. I promised him that Emma and I would work together to make sure he and Chloe were supported through whatever came next. Tyler's questions were heartbreakingly perceptive. He wanted to know if I was angry at him and Chloe for existing, if their family had caused my marriage to end, if he should have somehow known that David was keeping secrets. I assured him that children were never responsible for adult problems, that I didn't blame him or his sister for anything that had happened, and that the only person responsible for this situation was David. The most profound moment of our conversation came when Tyler asked if I thought David was a bad person. I realized this 8-year-old was grappling with the same questions I'd been wrestling with. How to reconcile the man who'd been loving and present in their lives with the man who'd systematically deceived everyone he claimed to care about. I told Tyler that people could do bad things without being entirely bad, but that didn't mean the people they hurt had to accept their behavior or pretend it was okay. By the end of our conversation, Tyler seemed to understand that what was happening was complicated and painful for everyone involved, but that the adults in his life were working to protect him and his sister. He hugged me before he left, thanking me for being honest with him in a way that suggested he wasn't getting honesty from many other sources. 2 weeks after David's return from Disney World, Margaret informed me that he'd hired an aggressive divorce attorney who was already attempting to minimize the financial implications of his deception. They were claiming that his support of Emma and the children had been voluntary and didn't constitute dissipation of marital assets. They were arguing that his emotional affair didn't justify the financial settlement I was seeking, that his deception had been motivated by his desire to protect me from unnecessary pain. Margaret's response was swift and decisive. She filed motions for temporary support that would prevent David from continuing to drain our joint accounts to support his other household. She submitted evidence of his financial fraud to the court, including documentation of hidden accounts and false representations on legal documents. She requested an emergency hearing to address his attempts to hide assets and his ongoing financial obligations to multiple households. The legal proceedings revealed the full scope of David's deception in ways that were both vindicating and overwhelming. Bank records showed he'd been supporting Emma's household for 6 years, while claiming to me that money was tight and we couldn't afford major purchases or vacations. Tax documents revealed he'd been claiming benefits for Tyler and Chloe while simultaneously filing joint returns with me that didn't acknowledge their existence. Most damaging to David's case was the evidence of his legal commitments to Emma and the children. The adoption papers for Tyler and the birth certificate listing him as Chloe's father created ongoing financial obligations that would continue regardless of what happened to our marriage. He couldn't simply walk away from the legal responsibilities he'd taken on, but fulfilling them would require acknowledging the systematic deception that had enabled him to take on those responsibilities while married to someone else. As the legal battle intensified, I found myself settling into my new life with a sense of peace I hadn't expected. My design business was growing rapidly, fueled by creative energy I'd suppressed for years and professional ambition I was finally free to pursue. I'd reconnected with old friends and made new ones, building a social circle based on genuine connection rather than obligation or convenience. The apartment I'd thought would be temporary was becoming a real home, decorated with art I loved, and furniture that reflected my personal style rather than compromises with someone else's preferences. I was cooking meals I enjoyed, reading books that interested me, and planning a future based entirely on my own goals and values. Most surprisingly, I was discovering that I enjoyed being single. The constant background anxiety of trying to maintain a relationship with someone who wasn't fully present had been replaced by a calm confidence in my ability to create a fulfilling life independently. I wasn't looking for another relationship or trying to replace what I'd lost with David. I was exploring who I was when I wasn't defined by my role as someone's wife. 6 months after discovering David's deception, our divorce was finalized with a settlement that held him accountable for his financial fraud while protecting my future security. He'd been required to compensate me for the marital assets he'd diverted to support his secret family, but more importantly, the legal proceedings had created a public record of his deception that would follow him for years. Emma had eventually allowed David limited visitation with Tyler and Chloe, but their relationship was forever changed by the revelation of his lies. The children were in counseling to help them process the betrayal of trust and the collapse of the family structure they'd believed in. Emma was rebuilding her life as a single mother again, this time with a clearer understanding of her worth and what she deserved in a relationship. David, according to mutual acquaintances, was struggling with the consequences of his choices. He'd lost the comfortable life he'd built with me, the respect of friends and colleagues who'd learned about his deception, and the uncomplicated relationship with Tyler and Chloe that had been based on lies they could no longer ignore. He was facing the reality that his attempts to have everything had resulted in losing the things that mattered most. The woman I'd become through this process was someone I was proud to be. She was honest, authentic, and unwilling to accept less than she deserved. She was creative, ambitious, and confident in her ability to build a meaningful life based on her own values. She was compassionate but not gullible, trusting but not naive, open to love but not desperate for it. A year after finding those utility bills that changed everything, I was living a life I could never have imagined when I was married to David. 18 months had passed since I discovered David's secret family, and I was standing in the kitchen of my new home, a charming craftsman cottage I'd purchased with my divorce settlement, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was simple but loaded with implications I couldn't have anticipated. "This is Emma. David's in the hospital. The children are asking for you." The irony wasn't lost on me that my ex-husband's medical emergency was bringing me back into contact with the family that had unknowingly shared him with me for years. I'd maintained minimal contact with Emma since our divorce proceedings concluded, primarily through brief updates about Tyler and Chloe's well-being that she'd send occasionally. We'd developed an unusual relationship based on shared trauma and mutual respect, but we'd both needed space to heal from David's betrayal, without constant reminders of how intertwined our lives had become. I drove to Charlotte Presbyterian Medical Center with mixed emotions churning in my chest. I wasn't sure what I owed David after everything he'd put me through, but I knew without question what I owed Tyler and Chloe. These children had been innocent victims of their father's deception, and if they needed support during a medical crisis, I wasn't going to let my complicated feelings about David prevent me from being there for them. Emma met me in the waiting room outside the cardiac intensive care unit, looking exhausted and overwhelmed in a way that reminded me of how I'd felt during the worst days of discovering David's lies. She explained that David had suffered a massive heart attack at work 3 days ago and had been in critical condition ever since. The doctors weren't sure if he would survive, and if he did, there would likely be significant permanent damage to his heart function. Tyler and Chloe had been staying with Emma's mother while she spent most of her time at the hospital, but they were struggling to understand what was happening and why the man they'd called father for most of their lives might not be coming home. They'd specifically asked for me, Emma said, because I was one of the few adults in their lives who'd been honest with them about difficult truths, and they trusted me to tell them what they needed to know. Seeing the children again after more than a year was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. Tyler, now 10, had grown several inches and developed the angular features that would make him handsome as a teenager. Chloe, 8 years old, still had the dimple she'd inherited from David, and the serious expression she wore when processing complex emotions. Both children hugged me tightly when I arrived, clinging to me in a way that suggested they'd been carrying burdens too heavy for their young shoulders. We talked for a long time in the hospital cafeteria, away from the clinical atmosphere of the intensive care unit, about David's condition and what it might mean for their family. I was careful, to be honest, without being frightening, explaining that their father was very sick and might not get better, but that they would be taken care of no matter what happened. I told them it was okay to be scared, angry, or confused, and that loving someone didn't mean you had to forgive everything they'd done wrong. Tyler, with the emotional intelligence that had impressed me since our first conversation, asked if I was angry that David was sick. I told him that I was sad anyone was suffering, including David, but that being in the hospital didn't erase the lies he'd told or the damage he'd caused. I explained that you could feel sorry for someone's pain while still protecting yourself from their harmful behavior, that compassion didn't require you to forget about your own well-being. Chloe wanted to know if David's sickness was punishment for lying to everyone, a question that revealed how much these children had struggled to make sense of their father's deception and its consequences. I explained that bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people, that life wasn't about punishment and reward, but about the choices we made and how we treated others. I told her that David's heart attack wasn't caused by his lies, but that his lies had caused other kinds of damage that wouldn't heal just because he was sick. Over the next week, I found myself spending increasing amounts of time at the hospital, not because I felt obligated to David, but because Emma needed support, and the children needed stability during an incredibly uncertain time. David remained unconscious for days, and when he finally woke up, he was weak, disoriented, and facing the reality that his life would never be the same regardless of his physical recovery. The first time I saw David after his heart attack was shocking in ways I hadn't expected. The confident, manipulative man who'd controlled 2 separate families through lies and charm had been reduced to someone fragile and dependent on others for basic care. He could barely speak without becoming winded, and his hands shook when he tried to hold a cup of water. The physical transformation was dramatic, but what struck me most was how his illness had stripped away the facade he'd maintained for so long. When David saw me standing in his hospital room doorway, his first reaction was tears. Not the manipulative crying he'd used during our divorce proceedings to try to generate sympathy, but genuine grief for everything he'd lost through his own choices. He whispered my name and tried to apologize, but I stopped him before he could launch into what I suspected would be another attempt to rewrite history in his favor. I told David that I wasn't there for him, or because I'd forgiven what he'd done to me. I was there because Tyler and Chloe needed adults in their lives who could handle difficult situations without falling apart, and because Emma deserved support during an incredibly stressful time. I made it clear that his medical crisis didn't change the fundamental reality that he'd systematically betrayed everyone who'd trusted him, and that I had no interest in providing him with emotional comfort or absolution. What David said next surprised me with its honesty, perhaps the first completely honest thing he'd said to me in years. He told me he knew he'd destroyed everything good in his life through his selfishness and deception. He said he understood why I'd left him, and why Emma could barely look at him without anger. He acknowledged that Tyler and Chloe would grow up knowing their father was someone who'd lied to everyone he claimed to love, and that this knowledge would affect their ability to trust others throughout their lives. He didn't ask for forgiveness or try to justify his behavior. He simply said he was sorry for the pain he'd caused, and that he hoped someday I'd be able to remember some good moments from our marriage without them being completely overshadowed by his betrayal. It was the closest thing to genuine accountability I'd ever heard from him, and while it didn't change anything between us, it suggested that his near-death experience had forced him to confront truths he'd been avoiding for years. David's recovery was slow and complicated by the reality that he would need ongoing medical care and would never regain his full physical capacity. The high-stress lifestyle that had enabled him to maintain his double life was no longer possible, and he faced the prospect of being dependent on others in ways that would have terrified the controlling man he'd been before his heart attack. More challenging for David was the realization that his medical crisis hadn't magically repaired the relationships he'd damaged through years of deception. Emma was compassionate about his health needs but firm about maintaining boundaries that protected her and the children from further emotional manipulation. Tyler and Chloe loved their father but struggled with feeling responsible for his well-being while also feeling betrayed by his lies. I found myself in the unexpected position of helping Emma navigate the complex emotions surrounding David's illness and recovery. We spent hours talking about the difference between forgiveness and enabling, between compassion and self-sacrifice, between supporting someone through a crisis and allowing them to escape accountability for their actions. These conversations helped both of us process not just David's current situation, but the broader trauma of discovering we'd been deceived so thoroughly for so long. Emma decided to allow David to move into a small apartment near the lake house, where he could be close to Tyler and Chloe, but not living in their daily space. She would help coordinate his medical care and ensure the children could maintain a relationship with him. But she was done pretending they were a traditional family, or that his illness had erased the foundation of lies their relationship had been built on. The children's response to David's new limitations was mature beyond their years, but also heartbreaking to witness. They loved him and wanted to help him recover, but they were also angry about the lies he'd told, and confused about how to trust someone who'd deceived them so completely. They were learning, at ages 8 and 10, that love and trust were different things, that caring about someone didn't mean accepting their harmful behavior. 6 months after David's heart attack, I attended Tyler's 5th grade graduation ceremony at Emma's invitation. David was there too, still weak but determined to witness this milestone in his son's life. Watching the three of them together, along with Emma's mother and sister who'd become Tyler and Chloe's extended family, I was struck by how much healthier their family dynamic had become since David's deception was exposed. Without the stress of maintaining lies and managing 2 separate lives, David was more present with the children than he'd ever been during the years when he was juggling multiple identities. His limitations forced him to focus on quality time rather than elaborate activities, and his awareness of how close he'd come to losing everything made him more appreciative of the relationship he was allowed to maintain with Tyler and Chloe. Emma had evolved into someone stronger and more confident than the woman who'd trusted David's lies completely. She was dating occasionally but approaching new relationships with healthy skepticism and clear boundaries. She'd established a successful career as a nurse practitioner and was considering buying her own home rather than continuing to rent the lake house that held so many complicated memories. Tyler and Chloe were thriving in ways that suggested children could recover from betrayal and trauma when the adults in their lives provided honesty, stability, and consistent support. Tyler had joined the debate team and was excelling academically, channeling his analytical nature into constructive outlets. Chloe was taking piano lessons and had developed a close friendship with a girl in her class whose parents were also divorced. As for me, I was living a life I couldn't have imagined when I was married to David or even when I first discovered his betrayal. My design business had grown into a successful firm with 3 employees and clients throughout the Southeast. I'd traveled to places I'd always wanted to see, taken classes in subjects that interested me, and developed hobbies I'd never had time for when I was focused on trying to save a marriage that was already lost. I'd been dating someone for several months, a divorced father of 2, who understood the importance of honesty, communication, and mutual respect in relationships. We'd met through my hiking group, bonded over our shared love of outdoor adventures, and developed a friendship that had gradually evolved into something deeper. He knew about my marriage to David and the circumstances of our divorce, and his response had been appreciation for my strength, rather than pity for what I'd endured. The relationship felt completely different from anything I'd experienced with David. There were no secrets, no competing priorities, no sense that I was fighting for attention or acceptance. We made decisions together, supported each other's individual goals, and created space for the kind of authentic intimacy I'd never known was possible. I was learning what it felt like to be with someone who chose me every day rather than someone who kept me around for convenience while investing his real emotional energy elsewhere. 2 years after David's heart attack, Emma called to tell me he'd died peacefully in his sleep. The damage to his heart had been too extensive for his body to sustain long term, and while his death wasn't unexpected, it was still shocking to realize that the man who'd dominated so much of my emotional life for more than a decade was gone. I attended David's funeral, not to mourn the husband who'd betrayed me, but to support Tyler and Chloe as they grieved the complicated father who'd loved them imperfectly but genuinely. The service was small, attended primarily by family and a few close friends who'd learned about David's double life during his illness. There were no elaborate eulogies or attempts to whitewash his behavior, just honest acknowledgement of his love for his children and regret for the pain his choices had caused. Tyler spoke at the service, delivering a eulogy that was wise beyond his 12 years. He talked about loving his father while also learning from his mistakes, about the importance of honesty in relationships, and about his determination to be the kind of man who kept his promises and told the truth, even when it was difficult. His words suggested that David's legacy wouldn't just be the damage he'd caused, but also the lessons his children had learned about integrity and accountability. After the funeral, Emma and I had dinner together for the first time since David's hospitalization. We talked about how strange it felt to have closure on this chapter of our lives, how grateful we were that David had been able to repair some of his relationship with the children before he died, and how proud we were of Tyler and Chloe for handling such complex emotions with remarkable maturity. Emma told me she'd decided to move to Asheville with the children, where her sister lived, and where they could start fresh without constant reminders of the complicated family history they'd navigated for so long. Tyler and Chloe were excited about the move and the opportunity to attend new schools where they wouldn't be known as the children whose father had lived a double life. I realized as we said goodbye that Emma and I had developed a friendship based on shared experience and mutual respect that would continue despite the geographic distance. We'd supported each other through one of the most difficult periods of our lives, and we'd both emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable of protecting ourselves and the people we loved. Standing in the parking lot outside the restaurant where Emma and I had shared our final dinner in Charlotte, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since the day I found those utility bills at the lake house. The woman who'd discovered David's betrayal had been devastated, confused, and completely unprepared for the revelation that her entire marriage was built on lies. The woman I'd become was confident, independent, and grateful for the experiences that had taught her what she truly valued in relationships and in life. David's deception had been intended to allow him to have everything he wanted, without making difficult choices or accepting responsibility for his actions. Instead, it had ultimately cost him his health, his marriages, his reputation, and years of authentic relationship with his children. His attempts to avoid consequences had created far more serious consequences than honesty would have produced. I'd learned that betrayal, while devastating, could also be liberating if you chose to use it as an opportunity for growth rather than remaining trapped in victimhood. I'd discovered strength I didn't know I possessed, developed skills I'd never needed before, and built a life based on authenticity rather than performance. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own instincts, to value my own worth, and to refuse to accept less than I deserved in any relationship. The woman David had betrayed was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real love required honesty, respect, and mutual commitment to building something meaningful together. As I drove home to the life I'd created for myself, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. It hadn't been easy, and there had been moments when I'd wondered if I'd ever feel whole again. But I'd not only survived David's betrayal, I'd used it as a catalyst for becoming the person I was always meant to be. The lake house where I'd discovered the truth about my marriage was now just a place I sometimes drove past on my way to hiking trails in the mountains. The utility bills that had shattered my world were just pieces of paper that had served their purpose. The man who'd broken my heart with his lies was just a memory that reminded me how far I'd come, and how much I'd learned about my own resilience. I was free, authentic, and surrounded by people who valued honesty as much as I did. I was building something real with someone who chose me every day, not someone who kept me around while investing his heart elsewhere. I was living the life I'd always deserved, but had never known was possible when I was trying to make a relationship work with someone who wasn't truly available. David's betrayal had been the worst thing that ever happened to me, but it had also led to the best thing, discovering who I really was when I stopped trying to be who someone else needed me to be. In the end, his attempts to keep me in the dark had illuminated truths about myself that transformed my entire understanding of what I was capable of achieving. The story that began with devastating betrayal had become one of empowerment, growth, and the kind of happiness that came from living authentically rather than settling for less than you deserved. It was a story I was proud to own, and a future I was excited to continue writing on my own terms. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.